Hello everyone, my name is Jung Hee-ryun from Seogang University. The title of our study is WH infinite V and WH adjacency in Korean. This presentation is divided into two parts. This part is about the experiment, and this part provides theoretical explanation for the findings from the experiment. Let's begin with introduction. Korean is widely known as WH elements do not move overtly, and its word order is free. So it's been assumed that WH elements in Korean do not have any particular distributional property. With this, we set up research questions as follows. First, is the assumption the same as actual data? Second, is there the most preferred position for the WH element? If so, how are they distributed in WH questions? To answer these questions, we did an experiment. And in this section, we are going to look at the experimental design in section 2.1 and the distribution of WH adjunct in single and multiple WH questions will be presented in turn. The design for the experiment is as follows. There were three factors. The first factor was the type of adjunct, minus WH versus plus WH adjunct. Second, we looked at the plus minus WH adjunct with three different meanings, time, place, and reason. Then, as you can see here, we have 6 different types of plus WH or minus WH adjunct by 2x3 factorial design. So, 55 participants were asked to complete the declarative or interrogative sentences by inserting one of these adjunct expressions into one of 3 positions, like this: pre-subject, pre-object, and pre-verb positions. And this is the abbreviation form for place 1, place 2, and place 3. Let's look at the results from the single plus minus WH adjunct first. Table 1 shows the distribution of minus WH adjuncts in declarative sentences, depending on their meanings. For example, minus WH and time-related adjunct preferred to be in front of the subject. If we compare this with that of plus WH adjunct, we can see a pattern. Whatever the meaning is, all 3 plus WH adjuncts are preferred to be in front of the verb. Here, the figure of 46.4% does not seem to be significant because it's lower than 50%, but we should think this in this way. There were 3 different positions for 1 plus WH adjunct, and if we divide 100% by 3, then the average percent is about 33.3%. Then we can say that the figure of 46.4% is much higher than the average. It means that the pre-verb position is apparently the most preferred position for the plus WH adjunct, and we call this as a WH in front of V property. Based on this, we also examined multiple plus minus WH adjuncts. This was to see whether there's a pattern if there are 2 plus minus WH adjuncts in one sentence. So, here are 6 possible positions for the plus WH adjuncts, and let's assume that when and where were the given expressions. Then, the 2 WH adjuncts can be adjacent to each other, as in 11A to C, or they could be separated from each other, as in D, E, and F. Now, let's look at the results, especially focusing on the WH adjacency first. If we compare the plus WH with minus WH, the adjacency rate of plus WH adjunct is higher than that of minus WH adjunct in all cases. Therefore, we can say that there's a property of WH adjacency between the plus WH adjuncts. Then, a question arises whether there is a preferred position for the adjacent WH element or not. Our assumption is that As we shown in single plus WH adjunct, the adjacent to WH adjunct would also prefer the WH in front of V position. Then let's look at the results for that. Table 11 shows the number and the rate of responses to the preferred position. So, when the time-related adjunct and the reason-related adjunct are adjacent to each other, the preferred position is most preferred. If we compare this with the minus time and reason adjunct, there was no case that two minus WH adjuncts are adjacent in the preferred position. According to the result, this is the most preferred multiple plus WH sentence. 철수가 영희를 언제 왜 만났니? Like that. This is the result from the place and reason-related adjuncts, and the adjacent to plus WH adjunct prefer the preverb position the most. And if we compare this with minus WH adjunct, the result becomes more explicit. 16 shows the most preferred multiple WH question with place and reason adjunct. 철수가 영희를 어디서 왜 만났니? Like that. And the results from the time and place adjunct were the same. The preverb position was most preferred, but it was not in the case of minus WH adjunct. And here's the most preferred sentence with time and place adjunct. So, let me summarize the findings from the experiment. First, in single WH questions, plus WH adjunct prefer the preverb position, which we'll call it WH in front of V. Second, in multiple WH questions, plus WH adjunct has a property to be adjacent to each other. And also, the adjacent WH adjunct prefer the WH in front of V position in all cases. Before giving the theoretical explanations for the two properties observed in the experiment, let me introduce previously suggested three conditions to realize WH questions in Korean. The first one is C-command. As you can see in 18, 누가 학교에 갔니? And its tree structure, the WH element do must be C-commanded by the Q marker ni. If it's not C-commanded, as in 19, the sentence cannot be the WH question, because the Q marker 은가, which is in the embedded clause, cannot C-command the WH element which is outside of the C-command domain. Actually, this sentence is grammatical only if the 누가 is interpreted as an indefinite pronoun someone. But then the sentence is not the WH question but the declarative sentence. Like this, the realization of WH question can be explained by C-command. The second condition for the WH question is the notion of economy. For example, the sentence like in 20a, 철수는 누가 온다고 말했니? Here, the Q marker C-commands the WH element. Therefore, the sentence is a WH question. However, 20b, this is not a WH question but a yes-no question, because the embedded WH element does not agree with the Q marker ni, but agree with 은가, which is closer than ni. This indicates that the notion of economy is involved in an agreement relationship between the WH element and the Q marker. And the last one for the realization of WH question is sentence final intonation. As shown in 21, the sentence final intonation is different depending on the type of sentence. For example, yes-no question in A ends with a high-level intonation, while the WH question in B ends with a low-level intonation. And this is the one we are talking about. According to Lee 2013, for the sentence final intonation of a WH question, the WH element must agree with a Q marker at PF. Let's look at the relevant examples. In 23, A is grammatical when the object 영희를 is right dislocated. But in 23b, if the WH element 누구를 is right dislocated, then the sentence becomes ungrammatical. The difference between 23a and b could be explained as follows. A WH element requires plus WH sentence final intonation. And the sentence final intonation is possible when there is an agreement between the Q marker and the WH element. However, the right dislocated WH element cannot agree with Q marker at PF because there is no overt WH element here. Then the sentence cannot have the sentence final intonation, and therefore the sentence in 23B is ungrammatical. So, if we consider the sentence final intonation, we can explain why the sentence cannot be the WH question. In section 4, taking Chomsky's 2005 efficient computation as a guiding principle, we consider the two aspects of economy at PF: economy of distance and economy of operation. To explain the property of WH in front of V first, let me recall the results from the single WH questions. In 25C, which is the most preferred single WH question, the WH adjunct 언제 prefers to appear in front of V position. Let's consider the C-command relationship between the WH adjunct and the Q marker ni. Each WH adjunct in 25 is successfully C-commanded by the Q marker. Therefore, the difference in preference between the sentences in 25 cannot be explained with C-command. Then, can we account for the difference in 25 with economy? If we consider the syntactic notion of economy, which is hierarchical, the most preferred sentence would be 25A, because 언제 is hierarchically in the closest position to the Q marker. However, if we consider the economy at PF, especially after the linearization, the most preferred sentence would be 25C, and this is the one we got from the actual data. Therefore, our proposal for the property of WH in front of V is that both economy of distance at PF and the realization of sentence final intonation for the WH question must be considered together. And as illustrated in 26, repeated from 25, if the WH element and Q marker agree in the closest distance at PF, then it becomes the most preferred WH question. Now, let me recall the results from the multiple WH elements. The most preferred WH question is 27C. The two WH adjuncts are adjacent to each other. To explain this, I'd like to talk about some characteristics of WH elements. First, a WH element is considered as an indefinite form with a focus. And as mentioned, it should agree with a Q marker to get a sentence final intonation. Second, if WH elements are adjacent to each other, they form a single rhythm unit. With this, let's look at the data again. 28 is repeated from 27C, the most preferred WH question. Here, the adjacent WH adjuncts form a single rhythm unit. Therefore, only one time operation between the rhythm unit and the Q marker is sufficient for the agreement at PF. However, if WH elements are not adjacent to each other, two different rhythm units leads to two different operations. Therefore, we believe that the economy of operation at PF and the rhythm unit must be considered together to explain the WH adjacency in Korean. However, a question could arise here. If 언제, 철수가, and 어디서 form a rhythm unit like this, then the agreement operation occurs only once, the same as 28. Then why 29A is less preferred than 28? The answer to this is simple. The WH elements 언제 and 어디서 are focuses. However, 철수가 is not the focus. Then they cannot form a single rhythm unit and the one-time operation is impossible. Therefore, 언제 어디서 in 28 is more preferred than 언제 철수가 어디서 in 29A. Like this, The WH adjacency in Korean is explained by considering the rhythm unit and the economy of operations at PF. In section 5, we provide additional evidence to support our proposal. The first evidence is about particle yo in Korean. If the particle yo is attached to the WH element, as in 32A, the sentence becomes very degraded. 누가요 거기에 갔어요? But it's natural for non-WH element, as in 32B. 철수가요 거기에 갔어요? Like this. This can be explained by comparing the property of sentence medial yo with the property of WH elements. First, sentence medial yo is only possible when the sentence final ending also has an honorific marker as shown in 33. And another property of the sentence medial yo is that it forms a strong prosodic boundary. On the other hand, WH element has weak prosodic boundary between itself and the cue marker. This means that the properties of sentence medial yo and the WH elements are different from each other. Based on this, now consider the examples in 34 repeated from 32 with two other additions. In 34A, there's no sentence medial yo, and thus there's no prosodic boundary between the WH element and the cue marker. However, in 34B and C, there are sentence medial yo, and it means that there's a strong prosodic boundary which blocks the agreement between the WH element and the cue marker. Then, the failure of the agreement makes the sentence degraded. And the other supporting evidence is that the two properties observed in WH adjunct are also observed in WH argument as presented in 35. The adjacent WH arguments are much more preferred than the separated one. And this data is based on the experiment, but there are a few important considerations like WH argument and an indefinite pronoun appear in the same form in Korean. So we'll discuss the distribution of WH arguments in the further research. And to sum up the main points of this study, this study provides noticeable distinction between the -WH and the +WH adjuncts in Korean. The distribution of -WH adjunct is relatively freer than +WH adjunct, which turns out to have two properties, WH in front of V and WH adjacency. As a theoretical explanation, we consider the notion of economy at PF, especially economy of distance and sentence final intonation can explain why WH elements tend to be in front of the verb. And the WH adjacency is explained by considering the economy of operation at PF and the rhythm unit. As we've discussed, the adjacent WH elements form one rhythm unit, and this leads to an efficient operation. And this is the reference page. If you have any questions or comments, we'd be very happy to answer them. Thank you.